Thomas had packed 3 things for the medical screening: his transit documents, his employee badge from the Interstellar Labor Coordination Office, and a novel he had been meaning to finish for approximately 4 months. The novel was not very good, which was precisely why he had never finished it, but it was the kind of not very good that required just enough attention to pass the time without demanding anything emotionally. He had calculated, based on the 30-minute estimate given by the orientation packet, that he would get through at least 2 chapters. He was optimistic about this. He was, in general, an optimistic person. This was one of the things that would be tested today, though he did not know that yet. The Hareth Prime Medical and Biological Screening Facility sat at the eastern edge of the transit hub, separated from the main terminal by a corridor that smelled faintly of something Thomas could not identify. Not unpleasant, somewhere between rain and copper, with a quality to it that made him feel, irrationally, that he should be standing up straighter. The building itself was low and wide, with walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and a front desk staffed by someone whose species Thomas did not recognize, but who processed his paperwork with the efficient warmth of a person who has checked in 11,000 beings this year and found, on balance, that most of them were fine. He was given a number. The number was not a numeral he recognized. He sat down anyway. The waiting room was full in the quiet, particular way of places where everyone is pretending not to look at everyone else. There were perhaps 20 individuals distributed across the seating, representing what Thomas estimated conservatively at 8 different species, though he was aware his ability to estimate this was roughly equivalent to a person who had read 1 book about birds confidently identifying clouds. 2 of them had what appeared to be additional limbs folded politely against their sides. One was reading something on a device that projected text into the air in a language that looked like music notation, if music notation had opinions. Several of them glanced at Thomas when he sat down, not rudely, not even with particular curiosity, but with the mild, reflexive attention of people who have spotted something slightly out of the ordinary and are being very dignified about it. He was, as far as he could tell, the only human in the room. He opened his book. The protagonist was, once again, making a poor decision about a warehouse. Thomas read the same paragraph twice, retained nothing, and turned the page anyway. A staff member appeared beside him without having made any sound of approach, which was impressive given that the floor was hard and Thomas's nerves were, by now, mildly tuned. He thought she, though he acknowledged the uncertainty, was tall, precise in her movements, and carrying a small tray with a collection of instruments that looked simultaneously medical and like something a jeweler might use. She explained the sample collection process in excellent common tongue, with an accent that rounded the edges of every word into something almost musical. She asked him to relax his left hand. He relaxed his left hand. She took what she needed in under 90 seconds, thanked him with the professional sincerity of someone who meant it without making it personal, and disappeared back through a door that did not make a sound either. He turned back to his book. The protagonist had now made a second decision about the warehouse, compounding the first. 30 minutes passed. Thomas finished the chapter. It had resolved nothing. He considered, not for the first time, that he and the protagonist might be the same person, and that this thought was too dispiriting to pursue any further in a medical waiting room on a planet he had been on for less than a day. 40 minutes after he had arrived, a nurse appeared at the interior door and called a name that was not his number. He looked up anyway. She clarified. He was not being called yet. He settled back. Across the room, the individual with the air-projected text turned a page that did not exist, and the notation rearranged itself into something that might have been a new chapter or might have been a different argument entirely. Thomas watched this for a moment. It was, he thought, considerably more interesting than the warehouse. It was another 6 minutes before his number, translated, apologetically, into something he could read on the small screen above the inner door, appeared. He gathered his documents, folded the corner of his page with the mechanical optimism of a man who fully expected to return to this book very shortly, and walked through the door that, like all the others in this building, opened without sound and closed the same way, as though the facility had collectively decided that noise was an imposition it was not willing to make. He sat down in the examination room. It was clean, well-lit, and contained a table, 2 chairs, and a counter with equipment he did not recognize. He put his book on the table. He read one more sentence. The door opened, and the doctor walked in, and she was carrying his results, and behind her was a colleague, and both of them had the specific, carefully neutral energy of people who have looked at something more than once and have decided together that they need a second opinion on how to begin. The doctor set the results on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone placing something fragile, though the document itself was neither fragile nor particularly large. It was a single printed sheet and a secondary readout on a slim display panel, and together they apparently contained enough information to bring 2 medical professionals into the same room with the same expression, which Thomas was beginning to think of as the expression of people who have opened a door expecting a cupboard and found a staircase. She introduced herself as Eva. Her colleague, standing slightly to her left and slightly behind her in the way of someone who wanted to be present without being responsible for the conversation, was Sorn. Thomas introduced himself, which felt faintly absurd given that they had just spent the better part of an hour doing detailed biological analysis of him. But social mechanics did not pause for absurdity, in his experience, and he had a great deal of experience. Eva sat down across from him. Sorn remained standing. Thomas noted this without knowing what to do with it and filed it alongside the other things he was collecting this afternoon. Her ears, he noticed now that she was closer, were long, not dramatically so, not in the way of something designed for performance, but with the natural, unhurried taper of something that had arrived at its shape through generations of refinement. They shifted very slightly as she settled into the chair, and he had the sense that they were doing something functional rather than expressive, though he could not have said what. He looked back at the document on the table because it was there, and because it seemed to be where the conversation was going. She placed her finger on a sequence near the middle of the readout. He looked at it. It was dense and notational, built from a system of biological nomenclature that he recognized as biological nomenclature in the same way that he recognized a foreign language as a language, structurally, without content. He told her as much. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating the starting point of an explanation, and he got the impression that she had prepared the explanation for a slightly different version of this conversation, one in which he could read the document and had arrived already upset. She asked him what he knew about human genomic baseline mapping. He said he knew that it existed and that it had been completed sometime in the previous century, and that it was considered an important achievement by people who understood what it meant, which did not include him. She nodded as if this were a reasonable answer, which it was, and then she asked what he knew about interspecies genetic compatibility. He said he knew less about that. She nodded again. Sorn, behind her, shifted his weight in the way of a person who is watching someone else navigate a conversation they have already had internally and finding it, despite themselves, interesting. Eva explained that standard human DNA, when analyzed at the Hareth Prime facility, produced a profile consistent with known Terran biological architecture. Consistent meant, she clarified, that it fell within certain ranges, carried certain markers, and told a certain kind of story. One that began on one planet, developed over a specific and documented period, and arrived in the present without detours. His profile, she said, did not do this. His profile told that story for approximately 94% of its length, and then, in a cluster of sequences that she indicated with her finger, said something else entirely. Something that was not Terran in origin, not Terran in structure, and not, as far as any model she had access to could determine, the result of contamination, mutation, or error. Thomas looked at the sequences she was indicating. They continued to mean nothing to him visually, which he mentioned. She said she understood. She said that the visual meaninglessness was, in its way, not his fault. He said he appreciated that. She said it was not a compliment. He said he knew, but he was choosing to receive it as one, because it was turning out to be that kind of afternoon. Sorn made a sound. It was brief and quickly professional again, but it had, for just a moment, the quality of something involuntary. Eva looked at Thomas for a moment with the careful attention of someone deciding not just what to say next, but in what order to say a collection of things that were all, individually, significant, and that arranged themselves badly if assembled wrong. He had the sense that she was genuinely trying to do this correctly, not for procedural reasons, but because she was the kind of person for whom correctly mattered on its own terms. He found, somewhat to his surprise, that he trusted her. He was not certain this was rational. It was, however, what was happening. She said there was one additional piece of information she needed to give him before she continued with the explanation. He said that was fine. She said that sometime in the last 40 minutes, while he had been in the waiting room reading, 2 members of a security escort had taken up a position outside the examination room door. He turned and looked through the glass panel beside the door. There were, indeed, 2 uniformed figures standing in the corridor with the elaborate stillness of people pretending to be furniture. He turned back. He asked why no one had told him. She said they had wanted to understand what they were looking at first. He considered this. He said it seemed fair. He also said that it was, nonetheless, a detail he wished had come up slightly earlier, such as before he had spent 6 minutes reading about a warehouse while being quietly surrounded. Eva said she was sorry about the warehouse. He looked at her. She held his gaze with the composure of someone who had not just said that, and yet demonstrably had. He decided in that moment that he liked her. He was not certain this was the appropriate response to the situation. It was, however, the one he had. Eva began with biology because biology was where the evidence lived, and she was, at her foundation, a person who preferred to build arguments from the ground up rather than hand someone a conclusion and work backward. Thomas appreciated this in the abstract. In the specific, he was sitting in a medical examination room on a planet he had arrived on 26 hours ago with a security escort outside the door and a novel about a warehouse on the table in front of him. And the ground, as a starting point, felt somewhat far away. She explained that the human genome, in its documented and mapped form, was a remarkably stable document. It changed, as all living things changed, but it changed slowly and within predictable parameters, and those parameters had been studied long enough that any significant deviation from them was not something that could be attributed to ordinary variation. The sequences she had identified in his profile were not a deviation in that sense. They were not an anomaly or an error or a thing that had gone wrong. They were a thing that had been added carefully, completely, and at some point sufficiently far back in his ancestry that they had been inherited rather than introduced. They were, she said, using a word he did not recognize and then immediately translating it, legacy markers. The biological equivalent of a name written inside the cover of a book. Thomas thought about this. He asked whose name. Eva said that was the part that had caused her to bring Sorn. Sorn, who had been standing with the patient stillness of a person who knew he was in someone else's scene, but was finding it difficult not to have opinions about the blocking, straightened slightly at this. He had a display tablet under his arm that he had not yet produced, and Thomas got the impression that the tablet contained something Sorn was very much looking forward to showing someone, and was exercising considerable professional restraint about. Eva told him that the markers corresponded to a genetic lineage, catalogued in the Herath Biological Registry, approximately 300 years ago. The lineage belonged to a family. She used a word that translated imperfectly as family but carried additional weight, something closer to house or line, with the implication of duration and significance. That had been prominent in Herath political history for a very long time before that. The registry entry had been flagged, she said, and the flag had been there for a long time, and the flag was the reason the escort was outside the door, because the flag was not a medical flag. Thomas asked what kind of flag it was. She said it was the kind that belonged to the Office of Hereditary and Civic Continuity. He said he did not know what that was. She said most people didn't, which was considered by the office to be one of its professional achievements. He looked at the door. The two figures in the corridor had not moved. They had the quality of people who were very good at their jobs, which he was finding, paradoxically, less reassuring than if they had appeared merely competent. Competent people made mistakes. These people looked like they did not make mistakes, which meant that whatever they were here for it correctly and completely, and that was a different category of situation. He turned back to Eva and asked her, with the measured calm of a man who had decided that panic was not going to be useful, and had set it aside the way you set aside a coat in a warm room, what exactly was in his DNA that required an office that most people had never heard of to send two people to stand outside a medical facility door without telling the patient. Eva looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Sorn. Sorn produced the tablet. The display that came up was a genealogical map. He could read that much from its structure, the branching lines and node points that any family record used regardless of species, because apparently the universe had independently arrived at trees as the correct metaphor for ancestry, which he found oddly comforting. At the base of the map was a name in Herath script that he could not read. At the top of the map, connected by 3 centuries of carefully documented lineage, was a designation that the tablet translated automatically, unprompted, as though it had been waiting for exactly this moment to be useful. The translation read, Founding Bloodline First Compact Herath Prime. Thomas looked at this for a long moment. Then he looked at Eva. Then he looked at Sorn, who had the expression of a person who has been carrying a very interesting piece of information for 40 minutes and has finally been allowed to put it down somewhere. He asked, because it was the question that had risen to the surface ahead of all the other questions, whether this meant what he thought it meant. Eva asked what he thought it meant. He said he thought it meant that somewhere in his family, on a planet he had never visited before yesterday, there was a branch of a tree that someone had been looking for. She said that was a reasonable summary, though the full answer was larger. He said he had gathered that. He asked if the full answer was going to require him to still be sitting in this chair, or whether it was the kind of answer that could be delivered somewhere with better lighting and possibly something to drink. Sorn said something in Herath that the tablet did not translate. Eva's expression moved, briefly and precisely, in the direction of a smile. She told Thomas that the escort outside was authorized to take him wherever the conversation needed to go next. He said that was either very helpful or very ominous, and that he was not yet certain which. She said, with complete honesty, that it was probably both, and that she would accompany him if he wanted, because she had more of the explanation left and she preferred to finish things she had started. He picked up his book from the table. He was not going to read it. He knew he was not going to read it. He picked it up anyway because it was his, and because some part of him felt that leaving it behind would be conceding something he was not ready to concede. Eva watched him do this without comment, which he appreciated more than he could have easily explained. The corridor outside the examination room was longer than Thomas had expected, which was either an architectural fact or a consequence of the way time moves, when two uniformed strangers fall into step beside you without being asked. They did not touch him. They did not speak to him. They walked at exactly his pace, which required, he noticed, a subtle and continuous adjustment on their part because his pace was not consistent. It was the pace of a person thinking while moving, which tended to vary by about 15% depending on the quality of the thought. Eva walked on his left. She had brought the results with her, folded into a slim case, and she carried it with the ease of someone for whom documents were familiar weight. Sorn had remained in the examination room, ostensibly to file the preliminary report, though Thomas had caught the look that passed between him and Eva before the door closed, the specific look of two people who have agreed, without words, on which of them has the more interesting afternoon ahead. He asked Eva where they were going. She said there was a consultation room on the upper level that had been made available. He asked by whom. She said by the office. He asked if the office had known about the consultation room before or after the results came back. She said before, which meant they had prepared for a result they had not yet received, which meant they had been notified when his sample was flagged at the preliminary stage, which meant the flag system was faster than the notification system, because no one had told him any of this while he was sitting in the waiting room reading about a warehouse. He shared this observation with Eva. She agreed that it was a reasonable thing to notice. She did not disagree with the implied criticism, which he took as a form of honesty. The upper level was reached by a lift that moved with the smooth, almost apologetic efficiency of technology that had been refined past the point of sensation. Thomas had been on lifts that announced themselves with sound and feeling, that gave you a physical relationship with the distance traveled. This one simply decided to be somewhere else and then was. He found this faintly unsettling in a way he could not entirely articulate, and settled for noting that the ceiling of the lift was exactly the same as the floor of the lift, which was either a design choice or an indifference to the distinction between up and down that he was not sure he endorsed. The consultation room was large, genuinely and unexpectedly large, with a table that could have seated 12 and was currently seating no one. There were windows along one wall that looked out over the transit hub below, and beyond it, the wider geometry of Hareth Prime's central district, which arranged itself according to a civic logic that Thomas had not yet decoded, but that gave the impression of having been planned by someone who thought in longer timescales than cities usually allowed for. He stood at the window for a moment. He was not doing this for the view. He was doing it because standing at a window gave a person a moment that was socially acceptable, a pause that read as contemplation rather than delay, and he needed several seconds in which no one was going to hand him additional information. He got 11 seconds. Then he sat down because the alternative was continuing to stand, which would eventually stop reading as contemplation and start reading as avoidance. Eva sat across from him. The two escort members positioned themselves near the door in a way that managed to be both inside the room and not part of the conversation. A spatial negotiation Thomas found impressive in a way he did not intend as a compliment. She opened the case and set the readout on the table again, though they both knew he still could not read it. He thought she did it because the document was a useful thing to look at when the conversation required a moment, a shared object that gave both parties somewhere to direct their attention that was not directly at each other. He did the same thing with his book sometimes. He understood the impulse. She told him that the founding bloodline designation was not ceremonial. He asked what it was instead. She said it was juridical, which the translation rendered as pertaining to legal standing in a manner that could not be waived, suspended, or reassigned. He asked what legal standing. She said that under the First Compact, which was the founding constitutional document of Hareth Prime and several of its associated systems, members of the designated lineages held a category of civic status that had never been formally retired because the compact itself had never been formally superseded. It had simply been built upon, the way old cities were built upon, the foundations remaining, load-bearing, while everything above them changed. Thomas looked at her. He asked carefully what this civic status entitled a person to. She said the word for it translated most accurately as participant, though that translation lost considerable texture. He asked what texture. She said that in the context of the First Compact, a participant was not a citizen in the ordinary administrative sense. A participant was something older than that, something the system was, technically and without ambiguity, required to consult. He sat with this for a moment, Then he asked whether consult meant what he thought it meant. She said it depended on what he thought it meant. He said he thought it meant that a governmental structure older than his planet's written history was, on the basis of a DNA test he had taken because his employment contract required a routine medical screening, now obligated to ask him things. She said that was not an inaccurate summary. He said he wanted to be clear that he had brought a book. She said she remembered the book. He said he was not sure the book was adequate preparation for being a constitutional participant in a 400-year-old interstellar compact. She agreed that it probably was not. And then she said, with the careful gentleness of someone who has saved a piece of information for the right moment, that there was one more thing, and that this was the piece that had caused the office to move as quickly as it had. He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside the window, Hareth Prime continued its long, patient existence, entirely unconcerned with what was happening in this room, which was, Thomas felt, the appropriate attitude for a planet to have, and one he was finding it increasingly difficult to share. Eva said that the first compact had 23 articles. Thomas said that seemed like a reasonable number of articles for a founding document. She said that most of them were administrative, definitions, jurisdictions, the procedural architecture that held the rest of the structure in place. He said that also seemed reasonable. She said that Article 17 was different. He waited. She said that Article 17 concerned succession of civic authority, in the event that the primary governing assembly reached a state of irresolvable deadlock, and that it had been written into the compact not because the founders expected it to be used, but because they were the kind of people who planned for things they hoped would never happen. The way careful people packed emergency equipment for journeys they fully intended to complete without incident. Thomas said he appreciated that kind of person in principle. He was beginning to appreciate them less in specific. She said that the governing assembly of Hareth Prime had been in a state of formal deadlock for 11 months. He looked at her. She said it calmly, the way you say things that have been true for long enough that the shock of them has worn smooth, leaving only the fact. 11 months of legislative paralysis, of proposals that reached the threshold and stopped there, of a governmental body that had become, through the slow accumulation of irreconcilable positions, something that could describe problems with great precision and solve none of them. He asked what they were deadlocked about. She said the honest answer was several things, but that the things had become entangled with each other over time in the way that unresolved problems tended to entangle, until it was no longer entirely clear where one ended and the next began. He said that sounded familiar. She said most political situations did, across species, which she had always found either comforting or depressing depending on the day. He asked what Article 17 said exactly. She opened the case again, though not for the DNA results this time. She produced a second document, older in its formatting, rendered in a typeface that carried the particular gravity of things that had been written to last. The translation function on the table's surface rendered it into common tongue as she set it down, the words appearing beside the original script with the slight delay of something working carefully. Article 17 said, in language that had been composed to be unambiguous and had succeeded, that in the event of irresolvable deadlock lasting more than 10 months, the Assembly was required to submit the matter to arbitration by a participant of the founding bloodline, whose determination would be binding for the purposes of resolving the specific deadlock, and would carry no other executive authority before or after. A single-use mechanism, Eva said, a key that opened one door and then ceased to be a key. Thomas read the translation twice. Then he looked up and said that he wanted to make sure he understood, because understanding seemed important here, and he did not want to proceed on the basis of a misunderstanding about something with this many moving parts. She said that was wise. He said he was a logistics coordinator for the Interstellar Labor Coordination Office, and that his current primary responsibility was ensuring that equipment manifests for 3 mid-range mining operations in this sector, were correctly filed before the end of the fiscal quarter. She said she was aware of his employment record. He said he was mentioning it for context. She said she understood the context. He said the context was that he was perhaps not the person Article 17 had in mind when it was written. She said Article 17 did not specify a person. It specified a bloodline, and the bloodline had specified him. He sat back in his chair. The chair accommodated this with the silent, engineered patience of furniture that had been designed for difficult conversations. He asked how the arbitration worked practically. She said a participant was presented with the nature of the deadlock, given access to all relevant materials, allowed whatever time they required to reach a determination, and then asked to deliver it. He asked if the determination could be wrong. She said it could be anything the participant decided, and that the compact did not evaluate the determination for quality, only for delivery. He said that seemed like a significant design flaw. She said the founders had apparently believed that a person with the standing to arbitrate would have the character to do it well. He said that was optimistic of them. She said most founders were, which was perhaps why founding documents tended to require so many amendments over time. He looked at the window. Below, the transit hub moved with the steady, purposeful energy of a place that had somewhere to be. He had had somewhere to be this morning. He had had a filing deadline and a lunch he had been mildly looking forward to, and 3 unread messages from a colleague named Dara who communicated exclusively in questions, and whose questions were, he now recognized with a clarity available only to people whose mornings have taken a significant turn, genuinely trivial in the most comforting possible sense. He asked Eva if she had done this before, told someone something like this. She said not like this, no. He asked what the closest comparison was. She thought about it for a moment and said she had once told a patient that a routine scan had identified a previously undocumented organ. He asked how that had gone. She said the patient had taken it well, eventually, after a period of sitting very still, and then asking whether it changed his dietary requirements. Thomas said he understood that instinct entirely. She said she had thought he might. He asked if this changed his dietary requirements. She said no. He said that was something. Soren appeared in the doorway. He had the tablet under his arm and the expression of a person who has been filing a preliminary report and found the experience insufficient relative to what was happening in the consultation room and has decided, on professional grounds, to rejoin the conversation. Eva looked at him. He held up the tablet. On it was a notification that Thomas could not read but that produced, in Eva, a stillness that was different from her ordinary composure, denser, more deliberate, the stillness of someone absorbing a new piece of information and integrating it into a structure that was already complex. She looked at Thomas. She said the assembly had been informed that a participant had been identified. He asked how they had responded. She said quickly. He asked what quickly meant in this context. She said the full assembly had formally convened for the first time in 4 months and was currently in session. He said that was either very good or very bad. She said it was probably both, and that she was noticing, developing a pattern of accurate assessments delivered at exactly the moment they became insufficient. He said he had always been better at understanding situations than resolving them. She said that was, historically, not a disqualifying trait in an arbitrator. He said he found that either encouraging or alarming. She said she knew. He picked up his book from the table, looked at it for a moment, and then set it back down. He did not need it right now. He was, for the first time since entering this building, not looking for something to do with his hands while he waited. He was not waiting anymore. Something had started, quietly and without his permission, and the most honest thing he could do was acknowledge that and decide, in whatever time he had before the next piece of information arrived, what kind of person he was going to be inside it. Eva watched him do this. She did not rush it. He was increasingly certain, exactly the right person to have in a room when a situation required someone who understood that some moments needed to complete themselves before anything useful could happen next. The assembly chamber was older than anything Thomas had ever stood inside. He knew this not because anyone told him, though Eva did tell him, but because the room itself communicated it in the way that certain spaces did, through the specific quality of silence they produced, which was not the silence of emptiness but the silence of accumulation, of every conversation that had ever happened in a place settling into its walls over centuries, until the walls themselves became a kind of record. He stood at the entrance for a moment and let it be what it was. Then he walked in, because the alternative was standing at the entrance indefinitely, which was not a position Article 17 had made provision for. The assembly was arranged in a semicircle of tiered seating, and every seat was filled. He had been told there were 214 members. Looking at him, he found the number both accurate and unhelpful, the way precise measurements sometimes were. Eva walked beside him. She had not been asked to accompany him into the chamber. She had also not been asked not to, and he had learned over the course of this long and structurally surprising day, a person who operated with considerable effectiveness in the space between those two things. He was shown to a seat at the center of the chamber floor, facing the assembly. The seat was simple, which he appreciated. He had half expected something ceremonial, something that announced its own importance through material and design. Instead, it was a chair, well-made and plain, the kind of chair that had been chosen to stay out of the way of whatever the person sitting in it needed to do. He sat in it. He put his book on his knee, because he had carried it this far, and putting it down now seemed like a statement he wasn't ready to make. The assembly's presiding officer, a title that translated with uncomfortable grandeur as keeper of the current moment, which Thomas decided immediately to think of simply as the chair, welcomed him in common tongue with the formal precision of someone reading from a text they had not expected to use in their lifetime. Thomas thanked her. She appeared mildly startled by this, which suggested the protocol did not typically include a response, which was a thing he was going to have to get used to, the gap between what situations expected and what he naturally did inside them. The nature of the deadlock was presented to him over the following hour by 3 speakers in rotation, each responsible for a different dimension of the problem. The deadlock concerned, at its most essential level, a question of resource jurisdiction over a region of contested space that 2 member systems had been arguing about with great articulacy, and no resolution for the better part of a decade. Around this central question over time had accumulated a structure of secondary disputes, procedural grievances, and matters of principle that had by now grown so thoroughly intertwined with the original issue that removing any single thread risked the integrity of the whole. He listened. He asked questions, several of which produced pauses that he interpreted as surprise and which Eva later confirmed were surprise. He asked them anyway, because they were the questions that occurred to him, and he had learned today that the questions that occurred to him were not always the wrong ones. At one point, he asked whether anyone had attempted to resolve the secondary disputes independently of the central question, on the grounds that a structure with fewer load-bearing complications might be easier to navigate. The pause that followed this question was longer than the others. One of the speakers said that the approach had been considered theoretically. Thomas asked if it had been attempted practically. The speaker said no. Thomas asked why. The speaker said that the parties involved had not agreed to separate the issues. Thomas said that was different from the issues being inseparable, and that he wanted to note the distinction for the purposes of his determination, which he was not ready to deliver yet, but was beginning to have thoughts about. Eva, seated to his left and slightly behind him in the spatial arrangement of someone who was present in an advisory capacity that had not been formally defined, and therefore could not be formally objected to, said nothing. She did, however, shift her weight in a way that he had come to recognize, over the course of this single extraordinary day, as the equivalent of a nod. He asked for an hour. The chamber gave him 2, without discussion, which told him something about how badly they wanted this resolved, and how carefully they had decided not to show it. He and Eva sat in a smaller room adjacent to the chamber with the documents spread across the table between them, and he thought out loud while she listened and occasionally said things that were, without exception, useful. He did not know enough about Herath law, about the specific histories of the member systems involved, about the 10 years of accumulated argument that had produced this particular shape of impasse. He knew this clearly and said so. What he had, and what he was increasingly willing to use, was the specific perspective of someone who had arrived at the problem from entirely outside it, without the decade of investment that had made the problem invisible to everyone inside it. He could see certain things precisely because he had not been looking at them long enough to stop seeing them. He delivered his determination in writing, which Eva had suggested, and which he had agreed was correct, because a written determination could be read and reread, and he wanted what he said to be available to mean the same thing every time. It took him 40 minutes to write. It was not long. It separated the secondary disputes from the central jurisdictional question and provided a framework for addressing them in sequence rather than simultaneously, beginning with the ones that had the most procedural resolution available and working toward the center as each layer was cleared. It did not solve everything. He said clearly that it did not solve everything in the determination itself in the second paragraph, because he thought it was important that the record show he understood his own limits. It solved enough to move. And moving, he had decided, was what Article 17 had actually been for. The chamber received the determination in a silence that was different from the earlier silence. This one had direction to it. The presiding officer read it twice, which he watched from his seat in the center of the floor with the specific patience of a man who had been patient all day and had, somewhere in the last 2 hours, stopped finding it difficult. The vote to accept the determination was not unanimous. It was sufficient. The compact required sufficiency, not unanimity, because the founders had understood, with the practical wisdom of people who had actually tried to build something lasting, that unanimity was a thing you hoped for, and sufficiency was a thing you could govern with. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, Sorn found them. He had the tablet and the expression of a person who had spent the day filing reports about someone else's extraordinary experience, and had decided that the filing was, itself, a form of participation he was going to be satisfied with. He showed Thomas the preliminary notation in the civic record, the single line that had been added to the Herath registry in the last 10 minutes. Thomas read it with Eva translating quietly beside him. It said his name, his planet of origin, the date, and his designation under the first compact, followed by a status marker that translated as resolved and discharged, meaning the participant status was fulfilled and complete, the key having turned and the door having opened and the key being, as promised, no longer a key. He looked at this for a long moment. Then he asked Eva what happened now. She said he had a filing deadline and a colleague named Dara with several unanswered questions. He looked at her. She said Sorn had been thorough in the preliminary report. He said that was either professional or invasive. She said in her experience those were not mutually exclusive. He laughed. It was the first time he had laughed since entering this building, and it was the uncomplicated laugh of someone who has come through a long day intact and knows it. She walked him to the transit level. At the point where the corridor divided, one direction toward the medical facility exit, the other toward the civic quarter where she worked, she stopped, and so did he. He was still carrying the book. She looked at it. He looked at it. He held it out to her. She took it with the expression of someone accepting a thing they did not expect and were not sure they deserved, which was, he thought, exactly the right way to receive something given freely at the end of a day like this one. He told her the protagonist made a bad decision about a warehouse in Chapter 4, but that it got better after that. She said she would keep that in mind. He He said he meant it as a general principle as much as a plot summary. She said she knew. Her ears shifted slightly, in the particular way he had noticed when she was thinking about something more than she was saying, and she looked at him with the calm, clear attention of someone filing a moment away carefully, in a place where it would keep. He walked out of the building into the Hareth Prime afternoon, which was neither warm nor cold but something in between that had no name in any language he spoke. And he thought that this was probably fine, that not everything needed a name immediately, that some things were allowed to simply be what they were while you figured out what to call them. He had a deadline. He had questions from Dara. He had, somewhere in the civic record of a planet, he had arrived on 26 hours ago. A single line with his name on it that would remain there long after everything else about this day had become a story he told in the way people told stories that no one entirely believed, not because they were impossible, but because the universe was larger than anyone's expectations of it, and occasionally it proved this in ways that were personal and inconvenient and, in the end, something very close to extraordinary. He flagged a transit pod. It arrived without sound. He got in and told it where to go, and it went, and behind him Hareth Prime continued its long, patient existence, which was, he had decided, exactly what a planet should do.